Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to talk about an unsung hero of the Civil War navies. That's the engineers. These men, sort of like the bass player in a band, quietly strumming to keep all the rest of the crew, all the rest of the band playing the same tune, same cadence, the same rhythm. These engineers worked quietly, they were behind the scenes, keeping the advanced technology of the engines going. Remember, this is a time in technology where the era of wood is giving away to metal, all kinds of interesting advances in steam, fired vessels, and engines, all kinds of interesting engine designs. So engineers really had to know their stuff. And such is the case with Benjamin Wood. He was a peacetime, as you'll find out, a peacetime worker in New York who was involved in steam engines, and he plays an important role in the early development of them. So, to tell you Benjamin's war story, I want to take you to February 1st, 1864, off the coast of North Carolina near Wilmington, where a blockade runner, the Wild Dayrell, is in serious trouble. The Wild Dayrell was a sleek, side wheeled steamer that had bottomed out in low waters along the coast just above Wilmington. During the early morning hours of that day, February 1st, 1864, her frantic crew tossed cargo overboard to lighten the load and try and free the stranded vessel. The boilers were fired up and the thick black smoke streamed from her stack into the sky. That black smoke caught the attention of a crew of a federal gunboat, the Sassacus, which happened to be cruising the Atlantic Ocean about half a dozen miles away. The lieutenant commander of the Sassacus, Francis A. Rowe, ordered his men into action. The crew included Benjamin Wood. Like many sailors, as I mentioned earlier, Wood, he was a peacetime, not involved in the military. He was an unpretentious and enterprising New Yorker in his early 20s, described by one comrade as a gifted engineer filled with good old fashioned gumption. Quote, he could see into a millstone as far as the wisest man. End quote. What a great, what a great compliment. And with his knowledge of slide rules and engines and modern technology, he was the perfect candidate for a ship's engineer. Part of his upbringing was working as a machinist for that company that built ship engines in New York City. In 1861, he set aside all of his instruments and machinery and stepped out of the factory, enlisted in the Navy, and was appointed a third assistant engineer. I should mention engineers highly desirable, especially those with the kind of knowledge, the specific knowledge about engines that Benjamin had. He began his service on a sloop of war, the USS Lancaster. Then he moved to the Sassacus. That was in 1863 and shipped out for duty with the Union blockade fleet off of Wilmington. Now, the newly commissioned Sassacus was named for a 17th century Native American chief. His name was Sassacus, and he was part of the Pequot tribe. The Sassacus was first in a class of gunboats, and I've got an image here to show you. You can see how beautiful and streamlined these ships are. They were uniquely outfitted with rudders at each end. You can see the shape is so similar. They were known as double enders. It was a novel design that enabled them to navigate back and forth in narrow inlets without having to turn around. So, quite an interesting design that would serve them well in the crazy inner waterways along the East Coast. So, now back to Benjamin. He impressed his new shipmates with his resourcefulness soon after he joined the crew. At one point, early after that launch, the Sassacus lost her steering gear during a storm at sea. There were several unsuccessful attempts to restore the steering before Benjamin improvised a temporary solution that saved the day and saved the vessel. While Benjamin was making his presence known on the Sassacus, the Wild Dayrell was commissioned on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean at Liverpool. Now, the Wild Dayrell happened to be named for an acclaimed British thoroughbred racehorse. And like that horse, the Wild Dayrell was built for speed. There's a reporter named Edgar Holden. He was a writer for Harper's New Monthly magazine, and he accompanied Benjamin and the rest of the crew of the Sassacus, and he was present during the Wild Dayrell's demise and wrote about that experience. He described the Dayrell as having a long, low hull with raking masts and a smokestack. The Wild Dayrell crossed the Atlantic bound for Wilmington via the port of Nassau in the Bahamas. The Sassacus found her at the mouth of Stump Inlet on that February day, February 1st, 1864. Holden, the Harper's writer, on board the Sassacus, described what happened next. Quote, swiftly, like a hawk on its prey, the Sassacus sped toward her. Scarcely 6 miles away, clearly visible as she was to us, almost indeed within the range of our guns, yet she tried to escape. End quote. Benjamin and his fellow sailors steamed close enough to see and understand that the ship was stranded. They saw bales of goods floating in the water around the ship. There were more bales that had drifted onto a nearby beach. They could see the desperate crew working feverishly to free the Wild Dayrell. Then the Sassacus fired a shot that whistled over their heads. Holden, that Harper's writer, he described the reaction of the enemy crew. Quote, helter-skelter ran everyone for the boats, and, leaving everything as it stood, with the engine still moving, they fled precipitously. A narrow creek led inland, and with all dispatch, they pulled up into it and disappeared. End quote. The Wild Dayrell was abandoned. Holden writes, quote, the surf dashed against her sides and at times completely washed her decks. Clouds of steam poured from her, mingled with the spray. It seems certain that the rebels must have set her on fire, great as was their haste. End quote. The commander, Francis Rowe, and a detachment jumped in a smaller ship, a boat, and they rode over and boarded the Wild Dayrell. Holden reported, quote, heavy cases of goods from firms in New York and of shoes marked from Lynn, Massachusetts, were lying about the deck, end quote. Holden added, quote, in the hold bales of dry goods were still swinging from the whips, while in the cabin all sorts of articles of toilet or apparel, hastily emptied trunks and valets, bottles and glasses were strewn about the floor, end quote. Rowe, the commander, he added to this, noting in his after-action report, quote, I found her furnaces filled with fuel and burning with the intention of destroying her boilers, end quote. Rowe and his men, including Benjamin, spent the next 2 days in several failed attempts to free the Wild Dayrell from that sandbar because they wanted to claim her as a prize. Meanwhile, the Union gunboat Florida arrived on the scene and pitched in with the Sassacus crew without success. They kept this up for 2 days. On February 3rd, a new threat emerged when Confederates, hidden along the beach, fired on the Union crews of the Sassacus and the Florida. Commander Rowe responded with his cannon and drove them off. By this time, no success, out of luck, and probably running out of patience, Rowe ordered his men to burn the Wild Dayrell. They torched the ship, and that was it. The writer Holden observed, quote, "The curling tongues of flame that now shot from the decks of the Wild Dayrell showed that the torch had been faithfully applied. Clouds of lurid smoke poured from the holds and enveloped the whole of her light masts, sails, and rigging." End quote. Holden added, quote, "To ensure complete ruin of her engines and to preclude the remote possibility of her ever serving again, either her owners or the rebels, both the Sassacus and the Florida took position, and shot after shot was fired through the iron hull. Bursting shells soon tore immense holes in bows, and stern, and threw masses of shattered deck and cargo high into the air." End quote. The Wild Dayrell soon exploded in a mass of flames, finally disappeared as it fell apart and was covered by water. The Sassacus continued to ply the North Carolina coastal waters on blockade duty. A few months later, May 5th, 1864, she suffered serious damage after boldly ramming the Confederate ironclad Albemarle in an engagement that went down in the record books as a drawn battle. The Sassacus continued in operation for another year until she was decommissioned. That was May of 1865. Benjamin Wood served as engineer all that time. He survived the ramming of the Albemarle, survived the action with the Dayrell, and managed to stay on in the Navy for 30 more years. A long career in the Navy. He served primarily in the North Atlantic, with the exception of a tour of duty in Asia in the late 1870s. He retired in 1892 as a chief engineer. A few years later, during the Spanish-American War, he came out of retirement for a brief stint working in the New York Navy Yard. After that, Wood returned to private life and lived until 1910, dying at age 79. His wife, Blanche, and two children, Mariette and Benjamin Jr., survived him. So there you have it, the story of Benjamin Wood, an engineer who came out of the civilian life working in New York as an engine builder, joined the Union Navy as an engineer, went on to blockade duty, and served the country well. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.